When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 12. They heard the horrendous screech as they entered into the lower levels. The mine area was so close. Kettinger was breathing hard, and that icy hand on his heart somehow got colder and squeezed tighter when he heard the screech. "They know," he said. "Yes, they'll be moving fast," King said. "We need to go back up into the shaft." "Why?" "I forgot about the door," King replied. "I can't believe I forgot about the door being closed. We either need to open it again or get around it." "Hang on," Kettinger said. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Jennifer, get the barrier door open, but just a fraction." "There are ghouls in there," one of the guards yelled. "Get your weapons ready," Kettinger replied. The huge door ahead of them began to rumble. A second later, the ghouls on the other side began to pour out. There were not a lot of them, however. The guards opened fire behind Kettinger and King. 3 of the dozen or so ghouls fell with their heads blasted apart. The rest came running forward at a dizzying pace. 2 more scrambled up a wall like spiders. King whirled around and grabbed a gun right out of Mike's holster. He turned and fired, both hands holding the pistol, dropping to his knees. He fired 3 shots quickly, and 3 of the creatures fell, heads blown apart. Even in the chaos, Kettinger had to admire the skill. How many had they managed to trap in the medical ward? Kettinger had no idea. They kept streaming out of the small gap in the safety door, all of them snarling, biting the air as if there was meat in it. If these creatures knew what was happening, then the others near the administration building would know almost instantly. How soon would they all be turned around and headed right toward the medical wing and the mines below? Not long. They were running out of time. "We gotta move," Kettinger cried. "They're all gonna know where we're headed. We have no time." One of the creatures leapt high into the air. Kettinger lost sight of it against the rest of the hive above his head. When it came down, it landed on one of the other men who trailed behind himself and King. He turned, but the shot went wild and high. He saw the creature lean forward, the needle-sharp teeth visible and dripping with some sort of fluid, and tore into the man's neck. The guard screamed, but it was cut off quickly, and then another of the creatures jumped on the pile, and Kettinger had to keep running and couldn't watch anymore. The distance between the cell and the sealed area was really no more than 20 yards. However, when there were grinning, evil ghouls headed for you, leaping and cavorting and gnashing their teeth, it might as well have been 20 miles. It felt like forever that they ran, but they all kept their heads. The guns fired and fired. Somehow, they shot down more of the creatures than not. Their group lost 2 more before they finally reached the sealed area through the giant door. "Close the door," Kettinger called into his radio, out of breath, hands on his knees. "That's going to lock you in," Jenny cried into her radio. "God damn it, Jen, shut the door, I know that." The ground and the air rumbled as the door closed. As soon as both doors met and shut tight, all of them heard pounding on the other side. They had just made it before creatures split off from the group at the admin building had reached them. "Just in time, eh?" Dalton asked, breathing heavily. "We made it." "Yeah, but I can't even imagine what's happening back at the building," Kettinger said. The creatures stood in the office, their heads turning slowly. They studied the furniture, the screens. When they realized that some of the humans were heading for their home, they dispatched some of their number. But at this point, it did not matter if they sealed off the area below. They were free after centuries. What they needed to do was add to their number. Once they reached a critical mass, the humans would be overwhelmed and they would control all of them, or have devoured those unworthy of joining the ranks. The one that had been called Q provided them with so much information. It was difficult to sort through it all as a collective when the bodies they wore dead and rotting. It took time for them to process what they were looking at, to understand, and to plan. Right now, they were planning, swaying in a breeze that was not actually there. There was a city, Hive City, an entire town filled with people, but it was barred from them. The gate. The gate was huge, and it was guarded by one man. Yes, now a plan had formed. They would get through this door and run up the side of this building. They would pour into the administration building and overwhelm the humans within. Once their numbers had increased, they would easily take the gate and then run into the city beyond. Once in Hive City, there would be no defense against their number. They would overwhelm the humans, turn more of them, and then they would find a way to use the lift. Let the humans hide behind the door in the mines. By the time they were willing to emerge, the horde would be gone, headed up to the surface. Once there, the world would be theirs. They would turn the world into a place where they would have food and a constant supply of new members. Now, how did they get through the blocked door? Those that were in the office scanned the door and the frame in which it stood. The door was reinforced with metal inside. However, the frame was mere stone. While that was strong, it was not reinforced and had been chiseled away by humans who did not understand stone. The Horde understood stone because they lived so much of their existence buried within the stone. If they had sufficient numbers, they would be able to make that stone crack. Then it would break, and the wall itself would come down. Then they would run. The call went out silently. It was a thought which spread throughout the horde below the windows, crowded around the hallways and the cells. Come up. Come up now. Outside the windows, the horde moved as one unit. They bared their teeth and began to make low growling sounds. Then, one by one, they began to scramble up the side of the building. Their claws grabbed at the stone, and they ascended fast, scrambling like ants. Soon they would be inside, and they would use their combined weight to break down the door. Soon. Kettinger King and the rest of the staff that had made it through walked quickly through the medical ward. Almost all of the creatures had run through into the rest of the prison earlier, and most of the rest had run through just now. They made quick work. King, come here, Kettinger said, as gunfire erupted from time to time as the guards finished off the rest of the creatures. We need to chat. King came over quickly, his eyes bright. To Kettinger, he had never looked more alive, at least not since he'd been in the Hive. He realized how much Dalton King thrived on chaos. This was making him alive again, awake, ready to take on a seemingly insurmountable task and grab it by the horns. What should we chat about, Mike? Dalton asked with a smile. Should we discuss the weather? Well, that's a short conversation down here. It's always the same. The same goes for politics. Stop goofing around. They're going to attack the administration building, Dalton. We have to get this sorted. What do you need? Dalton's face turned serious on a dime. I need to get access to the explosives you use for mining. We need to shut down the new part of the mine where these creatures came from. Then we need to do something that will utterly destroy these creatures. I was thinking I could rig some flamethrowers for the guards, but I was also thinking we could create some bombs that don't just explode, but burn. You're talking about making something like napalm, Kettinger said. Jesus Christ. Yes, Michael. We are at war here, you see, and we have to move fast. So just let me do my stuff, as they say. King set off like a kid in a toy store. He grabbed a large wheeled bin, usually used to move laundry around, and began running around the medical ward. He moved fluidly and efficiently, opening the cabinets and closets, and began to fill his wheeled cart with things. Canisters that Kettinger could not read, tubing and other things that he could not possibly tally. Kettinger walked around the ward, unable to bring himself to worry about what King was doing. If the man was creating a super weapon that he would turn against them all to get to the surface, there was nothing he could do about it now. He had to trust that this man, who had killed so many, was thinking of the people in the hive.
Kettinger, this is Jen.
Kettinger put a hand to his ear. Go, Jen.
The creatures are scaling the walls of the admin building en masse. They're piling into the office, Mike. They're pressing against the door.
That door is reinforced, Kettinger said. You know that, Jen.
They're piling in so many that the walls around the door are cracking.
Jen's voice was strangely flat. It was not a tone Kettinger was familiar with when it came to her.
The entire wall is going to come down.
Jesus, Kettinger thought. That's insane. Dalton King had wandered back over to where Mike stood. What's wrong? The creatures are piling into the office, and in such numbers that they're pressing against the door. The door is holding, but the goddamn stone walls around the door frame are breaking. King looked puzzled. We have seen what they can do. These things can run faster than humans, can scramble up the walls, and probably have strength beyond those of a live person. While we keep thinking of them as zombies, they are not. They are demonic entities who can think, plan, and have abilities we have not yet considered. I know you fear for your people, but we have to finish our task here, Mike. The men you have back at the building will need to fend for themselves. Mike felt a cold, icy hand on his heart. He hated being away from the people who were in his charge. He was the leader, the de facto mayor of Hive City, and here he was, buried deep within the hive, and nearly totally buried, away from all of them. He might as well have been on the far side of the moon. We couldn't even make it back in time to help them, Kettinger said, his mouth dry and his brain in a fury. We need to finish our task. Whatever I can do to help, let's do it. Then come with me and help me make these. Get your men to help me too. We need to blow up and seal off that new mine shaft, first of all. I can do that now. Then we need to make our armaments. Kettinger just nodded. His mind was split in two. One part of him was back at the building. He keyed his microphone. Jen, the men need to do their job. Everyone who has been trained in firearms, and all of you should have been, now is the time to start using those skills. Create some fallback areas. Look for places where you can run if you get overwhelmed. King, myself, and the men down here have to seal off the mine shaft, and then we'll be back with weapons to wipe those fuckers out. There's no way we can make it back in time. Do you read me? There was a long pause that hurt Kettinger's heart every second when she did not respond. Finally, Jen's voice came back, filled with steel and ice.
Got it, Mike. Be careful down there. Get back fast.
Roger that. Then the mic went dead, and Kettinger shook his head to try and clear it. He had to focus. Let's get to work, Dalton. Jen stood in the office and stared at the phone in her hand for a moment. Behind the door, the creatures were growling and snarling. The door creaked, and the walls around the door were already crumbling. Within the office, from the camera's viewpoint, the creatures were tearing at the walls with their hands, pulling out pieces of the stone wall. Plus, more kept piling in. Already they were shoulder to shoulder, and still they poured in. Up front, some of the ghouls were pressed against the door, unable to move. Jen walked into an empty office and tore off her blouse and skirt. Then she went into the closet and put on a jumpsuit that all of them in the office had. They were to be used in case of emergency, and if this wasn't an emergency, she didn't know what was. Then she put the shoulder holster on herself and made sure the pistol was loaded. There were extra magazines for the pistol, and she put them into the pockets, pulled out a pair of shooter's glasses, and then topped it all off with a blue baseball cap. With one quick glance in the mirror, she stepped out into the office. Once there, she cleared her throat, and the office workers, many of whom stood around, looked worried. Everyone, this is an emergency. Time to get the guns. If you've been trained, then get armed and get ready. Jen looked around and saw there were a few guards here. Guys, we need to get the guards up here and everyone who is trained. Those creatures are going to break through, and probably soon. We need to fall back toward the cafeteria here, so let's set that up so we can defend it. Then, if we lose that, we need to seal off the stairs and shut down the elevators and let them take the floor. Got me?" The guards nodded. There was no questioning what Jen was saying. They immediately got on the mics and told the guards to head up to the top floor. The office workers all set about changing into their own versions of the jumpsuits, and most of them also strapped on weapons. They had been trained and had to get retrained every year. This was a prison, and even though the inside of this building, carved out of the rock itself, looked like a typical office cubicle farm, it was still a place where dangerous men were housed. If there was a riot or someone got out of control, every person had to be trained to deal with the situation. Jen commanded, and they responded. Soon, the office furniture was piled to make barriers. One of them was about 20 yards from the office door. Then there were more pieces of furniture in the cafeteria, which was in the middle of the floor. There was one door in, and if they all went there, it would create a bottleneck. However, there was another doorway opposite, so they could retreat if overwhelmed. Behind them, as they worked to create barricades and make sure there was enough ammunition to keep them alive, the sounds of the creatures tearing, clawing, and digging their way through the doors was constant. Jen took control, and everyone just fell in line. Throughout the entire time they had been there, she had been the one who runs the office, and they just accepted she was in charge. When it was done, Jen took a post at the first barricade and held her pistol out in front, pointed toward the door. How much of the wall was going to come down? Depending on how wide the space was, there might be another bottleneck to keep the creatures from flowing like water over them. However, all of them had watched as the creatures leapt and crawled up walls. "Keep an eye on the walls and the ceilings," Jen said. "These fuckers can crawl all over anything and everything." All around her were the people she had worked with for years now. How many of them were going to die now? How many would end up bitten and turn? How many of her friends was she about to shoot in the head? Jen pushed those thoughts away. The cracking sound grew in intensity and then became a groan. Jen watched as a crack formed around the doorframe, roughly a foot from the edge of the door. "Here they come!" Jen cried. "Shoot for the head!" Just then, there was a loud sound that could only have been described as the building itself groaning and crying. Jen felt as if the building was dying. The entire office door and 5 feet of the surrounding wall fell forward. There was a crash and dust. "Shoot for the head!" Jen called as the dust blocked her view. The creatures poured in. It didn't take long for Dalton King to find the explosives. They wore masks as they went down into the mines, and King only had to look at the walls near the entrance of the new mine to know where to place them. Kettinger stood back and watched as he worked. King seemed to understand where all of the weak points were and where the explosives were needed. "Now that should bring the ceiling and walls down and seal this off," King said, muffled through his mask. "We should get back, since we don't entirely know what was in here to set this off. If there's dust, and I'm sure there will be, we don't want to be near it. Understand?" Kettinger nodded, and the two of them walked back up toward the medical ward. Once they were near the locker room area, King held up his hand. He nodded at Kettinger, who returned the nod, then he pulled out the small detonator and hit the button. The ground shook, and it took a few moments for the sound of the explosion to reach them. When the shockwave hit, King and Kettinger held on to the walls, but they did not fall over. Sure enough, a few moments later, there was a cloud of dust down the corridor, but it did not reach them in the locker rooms. Once all of that was over, they stood there for a moment, just listening. "Do we think it's sealed?" Kettinger asked. "I know my stuff, Mike. That mine is sealed off forever." "I'll trust you. Now, let's get the rest of this done. The building is under attack, and all of Hive City is in danger. If they get through, then what are we waiting for?" King replied. They headed back up the tunnel together. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next time for The Hive, Part 13. Written by Brian W. Alaspa. Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Catch up on the first 4 seasons of When the Night Comes Out now. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.